It was a calm evening, and Danielle Carter was driving home after a long day. The streets were quiet, the air cool, and the soft hum of her car engine was the only sound in the empty neighborhood. She was just a few blocks away from home when she noticed flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart sank for a moment, but she took a deep breath and pulled over to the side of the road. Danielle wasn't worried. She knew she had done nothing wrong. She wasn't speeding, she hadn't run a red light, and she wasn't driving carelessly. Still, she knew how these situations could sometimes turn out. As she rolled down her window, she reminded herself to stay calm and keep her phone ready. A tall police officer with a serious face walked up to her car. Another officer, slightly shorter but with a stern expression, stood behind him, watching closely. The taller officer leaned down and shined his flashlight into her car. "License and registration," he said in a firm voice. Danielle handed over her documents without hesitation. "Can I ask why I was pulled over, officer?" she asked politely. The officer didn't answer right away. He glanced at her license, then looked back at her. "You were speeding," he finally said. Danielle knew that wasn't true. She had been carefully watching her speed, especially since she was close to home. "I don't believe I was," she replied, keeping her voice steady. The officer's eyes narrowed. "Are you arguing with me?" Danielle shook her head. "No, sir. I'm just asking for clarification." The second officer, still standing behind the first, stepped forward. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Danielle's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "May I ask why?" she said, her tone still respectful but firm. The taller officer sighed impatiently. "We need to check your vehicle." Danielle's instincts told her something was off. A simple speeding stop didn't require a car search. She had seen enough cases like this to know that some officers use minor traffic stops as an excuse to look for something more. But she wasn't just an ordinary driver. She understood the law. "With all due respect, officer," she said, keeping her voice even, "unless you have probable cause or a warrant, I don't believe I'm required to step out." There was a brief moment of silence. The officers exchanged glances. It was clear they hadn't expected her to push back. Most people in this situation would have complied without question. The shorter officer placed a hand on his belt. "Are you refusing to follow a lawful order?" Danielle's heart beat a little faster, but she refused to let them see any fear. "I'm not refusing," she said calmly. "I'm just asking for my legal rights to be respected." She slowly reached for her phone and started recording. The red light on the screen blinked as she held it up, making sure to capture everything. The taller officer's face hardened. "Put the phone down." Danielle didn't move. "I have the right to record this interaction," she said. "It's for my safety." The tension in the air grew thicker. The officers seemed frustrated, but they also seemed unsure. They weren't dealing with someone who was scared or uninformed. They were dealing with someone who knew the law. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The night was silent except for the distant sound of passing cars. Then, without another word, the second officer reached for the door handle. Danielle's body tensed. She knew this situation was about to take a dangerous turn. But what these officers didn't know was that they had just made a very big mistake. Danielle's heart pounded as the officer's hand touched the door handle. The night air felt heavier now, the quiet street suddenly carrying an air of tension. She gripped her phone tightly, the recording still running. She wasn't going to let this happen without proof. "Sir, you do not have the right to open my door," she said firmly. "Unless I am under arrest, or you have probable cause, you cannot force me out of my vehicle." The officer hesitated for just a moment, then glanced at his partner. He was clearly annoyed, but there was something else in his eyes. Uncertainty. Danielle's confidence was making him second-guess himself. He probably expected her to panic or obey without question. Instead, she was standing her ground. The taller officer stepped closer, his voice sharper now. "Ma'am, you need to listen to instructions. Step out of the car." Danielle met his gaze, keeping her expression calm. "I'm happy to cooperate, but first, I need to understand why. Am I being detained, or am I free to go? The second officer let out a small laugh, shaking his head. This isn't a debate. Step out of the car. Danielle noticed how his hand hovered near his belt. She knew she had to be careful. She had done nothing wrong, but that didn't always matter in situations like these. She had seen too many cases where people's rights were ignored simply because they didn't know how to stand up for themselves. She took a deep breath. If I am not under arrest, I'd like to call a supervisor to the scene. The taller officer's jaw tightened. That won't be necessary. Danielle smiled slightly, though inside, she felt the pressure of the moment. If everything is being done correctly, then there shouldn't be a problem with calling one, right? The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned to his partner, who looked just as frustrated. This was not going the way they had planned. Fine, the taller officer finally said. We'll call a supervisor. Danielle gave a small nod. Thank you. The shorter officer muttered something under his breath before stepping away to make the call. Danielle kept the camera on the taller officer, who was now watching her carefully. He seemed to be studying her, as if trying to figure her out. What do you do for a living? He suddenly asked. Danielle raised an eyebrow. That question had nothing to do with the situation. Why does that matter? The officer smirked. Just curious. Danielle didn't answer. She wasn't going to let him play mind games with her. Instead, she focused on her breathing, keeping herself steady. She knew the importance of staying calm. A few minutes passed, feeling much longer than they actually were. Then, the second officer returned. Supervisor is on the way, he muttered. Danielle nodded again. Good. The officers stepped back slightly, though their eyes never left her. The power struggle was clear. They were used to being in full control. They weren't used to someone calmly and confidently pushing back. Danielle's phone was still recording, and she knew that every second of this was important. She had a feeling this situation wasn't over yet. And she was right, because when the supervisor arrived, everything was about to take another turn, one that these officers would never forget. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the quiet street as Danielle waited. Her hands were steady, her phone still recording, but she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The two officers stood near her car, whispering to each other, throwing quick glances in her direction. She could tell they were frustrated. They hadn't expected her to challenge them, and now they were waiting for their supervisor to arrive. A few minutes later, another police car pulled up. A man in a different uniform stepped out, clearly the supervisor. He was older, with a calm but serious expression. He walked up to the two officers first, speaking with them in hushed tones. Danielle couldn't hear everything, but she caught bits of the conversation. She's recording. She's refusing to step out. Says she wants to know her rights. Danielle took a deep breath. She knew this moment was important. How the supervisor reacted would decide how the rest of the night would go. After a short discussion, the supervisor finally turned to her. Good evening, ma'am, he said, his voice professional. I'm Sergeant Davis. What seems to be the issue here? Danielle held her phone steady. I was pulled over for speeding, but I wasn't speeding. Then these officers asked me to step out of the car without giving me a valid reason. I asked for a supervisor to make sure my rights are respected. The sergeant studied her for a moment, then turned back to the officers. Did you explain why you asked her to step out? The taller officer shifted uncomfortably. She was acting suspicious. Danielle frowned. Asking about my rights is suspicious. The sergeant didn't answer right away. He seemed to be thinking. Then, instead of calming the situation, he sighed and turned to her. Ma'am, just step out of the car so we can handle this quickly. Danielle felt her stomach drop. She had hoped the sergeant would be fair, but now it was clear. He was siding with his officers. With all due respect, Sergeant, she said carefully, I still haven't been told why I need to step out. Am I under arrest? The sergeant's face hardened. We don't have time for this. Before Danielle could say another word, The shorter officer reached for the door handle again. This time, he pulled it open. The taller officer grabbed her arm, pulling her out of the car. Danielle gasped. "I did nothing wrong. This is illegal." Her phone nearly slipped from her hand, but she held on, making sure everything was recorded. The officers ignored her words as they pushed her against her car. Cold metal cuffs snapped around her wrists. She could hear them talking behind her. Resisting. Being difficult. Should have just listened. Danielle's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had seen this happen before. People being treated unfairly. Their rights ignored. But this time, it was happening to her. As they led her toward the police car, she turned her head slightly and looked at the sergeant. "You just made a mistake." The sergeant barely reacted. "We'll see about that." Danielle took a deep breath and spoke loud enough for her phone to capture every word. "I hope you're all ready for a lawsuit." The officers laughed. They thought she was joking, but they had no idea who she really was, and by the time they found out, it would be too late. The cold metal of the handcuffs pressed against Danielle's wrists as she sat in the back of the police car. The small space felt even smaller, but she kept her breathing steady. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't panicking. Instead, she was planning. Outside the car, the officers were talking and laughing as if they had just done their job. They didn't seem worried at all. They thought this was just another routine stop where they had full control. They had no idea they had arrested someone who could turn this situation upside down. Danielle tilted her wrist slightly, making sure her phone was still recording. It was. The red light blinked softly, capturing every word, every move, every mistake these officers had made. A few minutes later, the taller officer walked over and opened the back door. "You'll get your one phone call at the station," he said, his tone almost mocking. Danielle met his gaze calmly. "Good. That's all I need." The officer smirked and shut the door again. The car started moving, taking her away from the scene. She watched through the window as the streetlights passed by, her mind already working through her next steps. By the time they reached the station, she was more than ready. The officers led her inside, removing the cuffs but still treating her like a suspect. "Sit down," one of them said as they processed her paperwork. Danielle did as they said, but her confidence didn't waver. When they finally allowed her to make a phone call, she didn't call a friend or family member. She called her legal team. The moment the call connected, she spoke in a clear, steady voice. "I've been wrongfully arrested. I need you to get down here immediately." There was silence from the officers as they realized she wasn't calling someone to bail her out. She was calling lawyers. And not just any lawyers. Danielle was a Harvard Law graduate, a civil rights attorney, a partner at one of the most powerful law firms in the state. The officers exchanged nervous glances. Their relaxed attitude started to fade. One of them, the shorter officer, cleared his throat. "Who exactly did you just call?" Danielle turned to look at him, her expression calm but sharp. "My firm. They'll be here soon." The room fell quiet. One officer stepped outside, whispering something to another cop. The sergeant who had overseen her arrest walked over, arms crossed. "Ma'am, let's talk for a second." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "I thought I was under arrest." The sergeant hesitated. There might have been a misunderstanding. Danielle almost laughed. A misunderstanding. They had dragged her out of her car, handcuffed her, and ignored her rights. Now that they knew who she was, suddenly it was a misunderstanding. Before she could respond, the station doors opened. Several people in suits walked in, her legal team. The officers stiffened as one of the lawyers approached. "We're here for Danielle Carter." The sergeant's face paled slightly. "You know her?" The lawyer didn't even glance at him. "She's our senior partner." The room went silent. Danielle stood up slowly, looking around at the officers. Their confidence was gone. Their mistake was clear. She took a step forward, her voice steady and controlled. "I hope you have a good explanation for why I was arrested. Because we're about to have a very serious legal discussion. The officers didn't say a word. Because for the first time that night, they were the ones in trouble. The silence in the police station was thick. The officers who had been so confident earlier now looked uncomfortable. Some shifted in their seats, others avoided eye contact. The sergeant, who had ordered her arrest, cleared his throat. "Look, Miss Carter," he started, his voice softer now, almost careful. "Maybe we got off on the wrong foot." Danielle held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Let's be clear," she said, her voice steady. "You didn't get off on the wrong foot. You violated my rights. You falsely accused me, forcefully pulled me out of my car, and arrested me without cause." The lawyers behind her remained silent, letting her take the lead. They knew she didn't need anyone to speak for her. She had built her career fighting cases just like this. One of the officers, the shorter one who had opened her car door, took a step forward. "Look, we didn't know who you were," he admitted. Danielle turned to him, her expression sharp. "And why does that matter?" she asked. "Would you have treated me differently if you had known? Because that's even worse." The officer's mouth opened, then closed. He had no answer. The sergeant tried again. "Miss Carter, maybe we can talk about this privately." Danielle shook her head. "No, we're not doing this behind closed doors. Everything that happened to me tonight was wrong. And it doesn't just happen to me. It happens to hundreds of people who don't have a team of lawyers waiting to defend them." The room was still. Every officer in the station was listening now. Some of them looked nervous. Others looked guilty. They all knew she was right. The lead attorney from her firm, a tall man in a dark suit, finally stepped forward. He placed a thick folder on the desk in front of the sergeant. "This is an official legal notice," he said. "We are filing a $1 million lawsuit against this department for wrongful arrest, unlawful detainment, and violation of constitutional rights." The sergeant's face turned pale. "A lawsuit?" Danielle crossed her arms. "Yes, a lawsuit." The officers glanced at each other. The atmosphere had completely changed. An hour ago, they were in control. Now, they were scrambling. The taller officer, the one who had first pulled her over, finally spoke. "Maybe we can drop the charges," he suggested quickly. "Make this all go away." Danielle let out a short, humorless laugh. "You think dropping the charges is enough? You dragged me out of my car. You threw me in handcuffs. You treated me like a criminal when I had done nothing wrong. And now, when you realize I can fight back, you suddenly want to make it go away." The officers had no response. The lead attorney adjusted his tie. "We expect a full public statement from the department admitting fault," he added, "and disciplinary action against the officers involved." The sergeant sighed heavily. He knew they were trapped. If this lawsuit went to court, it would ruin their careers. The department would take a massive hit. The officers who had arrested Danielle would have their names dragged through the media. Danielle leaned in slightly. "You made the wrong choice when you decided to treat me unfairly," she said quietly. "And now you're going to face the consequences." No one spoke, because for the first time that night, the police were the ones afraid. And Danielle, she was just getting started. The room was tense. No one dared to speak first. Danielle stood tall, her confidence filling the space. The same officers who had treated her like she was powerless now looked at her with uncertainty, even fear. Sergeant Davis slowly exhaled, his fingers tapping on the desk. He was clearly trying to figure out a way out of this mess. "Listen, Miss Carter," he started carefully. "Maybe we can come to an agreement. There's no need to take this to court." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "No need," she repeated. "You illegally arrested me, treated me unfairly, and only now that you know who I am, you want to come to an agreement." She shook her head. "That's not how this works." The shorter officer, the one who had opened her car door, looked uneasy. "Look, we don't want trouble." Danielle cut him off. "You didn't want trouble. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you put handcuffs on me for no reason." The lead attorney beside her cleared his throat and pulled out another set of papers from his folder. "This lawsuit is not just about Danielle Carter," he stated. "It's about a pattern of behavior in this department, a history of wrongful stops, unnecessary force, and ignored rights. This is not just a personal case, it's about justice." The surgeon's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what that meant. If this lawsuit moved forward, it wouldn't just be about Danielle. It would expose everything. Every bad arrest, every unfair traffic stop, every abuse of power. Danielle watched as the officers shifted uncomfortably. She could see it in their eyes. They knew they were wrong. Sergeant Davis sighed and rubbed his forehead. "What do you want?" he finally asked. Danielle didn't hesitate. "First, all charges against me are dropped immediately. Second, a full public statement from this department admitting that my arrest was unlawful. Third, disciplinary action against every officer involved." The taller officer looked angry. "That's too much." The lead attorney calmly slid another paper across the desk. "Or we move forward with the $1 million lawsuit and take this to the courts and the media." Silence. Danielle glanced at the officers. "It's your choice. Do the right thing now, or let the whole country see what you've done." The sergeant clenched his jaw. He knew there was no easy way out. He glanced at his officers, then at the lawyers. Finally, he let out a slow breath. "Fine," he muttered. "We'll handle it." Danielle narrowed her eyes. "Not good enough. I want it in writing." Sergeant Davis nodded reluctantly. "We'll draft the statement and begin the process." Danielle didn't thank them. She didn't need to. They weren't doing her a favor. They were just being held accountable. As she and her legal team turned to leave, she glanced back at the officers one last time. "Next time," she said, "think twice before you violate someone's rights, because not everyone you mistreat will be silent." And with that, she walked out, leaving behind a police station full of officers who had just learned a very expensive lesson. But this fight wasn't over yet. The world was about to hear everything. The cool night air felt different as Danielle stepped out of the police station. Just hours ago, she had been forcefully taken from her car, treated like a criminal, and locked in a cell. Now she was walking out with her head held high, knowing that justice was on her side. Her legal team followed close behind, their expressions serious. One of them, Mark, turned to her. "This isn't over," he said. "We need to make sure they follow through with everything they promised." Danielle nodded. "Oh, they will," she said. "Because if they don't, we'll take this fight to the highest level." She unlocked her phone and checked the recording. Every moment of her arrest had been captured. The way the officers had ignored her rights, the way they had treated her unfairly, the way they had only changed their attitude once they realized who she was. She opened her email and sent the video to her legal team. "I want this footage backed up," she said, "and I want a press release ready by morning." Mark smiled. "Already ahead of you." As Danielle headed home, her mind was racing. This was bigger than just her. What had happened to her tonight wasn't new. It happened to people every day. The only difference, she had the power to fight back. And that's exactly what she planned to do. The next morning, the news broke. Civil rights attorney wrongfully arrested. Files $1 million lawsuit against police department. The headlines spread like wildfire. News stations picked up the story. Social media exploded with outrage. People shared her video, calling for justice. The police department was flooded with calls and emails, demanding answers. By noon, the mayor's office had released a statement. "We take all allegations of misconduct seriously. This incident is under review, and action will be taken." Danielle wasn't surprised. The city couldn't ignore this case. There was too much evidence, too much public attention. The police department had no choice but to respond. That afternoon, the police chief held a press conference. He stood stiffly at the podium, surrounded by reporters. Cameras flashed as he cleared his throat. "After reviewing the footage and speaking with those involved, we acknowledge that Miss Carter's arrest was unjustified," he said. "We sincerely regret the actions taken that night." Danielle watched the broadcast from her office, her arms crossed. She had expected them to admit fault, but she wasn't here for just an apology. The chief continued, his voice controlled. Effective immediately, the officers involved in this incident have been placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. Danielle nodded slowly. It was a start, but she wanted real change, not just temporary punishment. That evening, she went live on social media. Thousands of people tuned in as she spoke. "This isn't just about me," she said. "This is about every person who has been stopped unfairly, every person whose rights have been ignored. The difference is, I had the resources to fight back, but not everyone does. That's why I'm using this case to push for real reform." Comments flooded in. "We support you. Hold them accountable. This has to stop." Danielle took a deep breath. "This isn't just a lawsuit," she said firmly. "This is a movement." And the fight wasn't over yet. Tomorrow, she was taking this battle to the courts, and the whole world would be watching. The courtroom was silent. Every seat was filled, reporters lined the back, and cameras flashed as Danielle walked in with her legal team. She had been in many courtrooms before, fighting for her clients, standing up for justice. But this time, she was the case. The judge entered, and everyone stood. The police department's legal team sat across from her, their expressions tense. They knew this case wasn't just about one arrest. It was about a system that had ignored the rights of too many people for too long. The trial began. Danielle's lawyer stood first. "Your Honor, we have clear evidence that Miss Carter's arrest was unlawful. The officers had no reason to detain her. They ignored her rights and only changed their attitude after discovering she was a civil rights attorney." He played the video from Danielle's phone. The courtroom watched in silence as the events of that night unfolded on the screen. The officers' harsh words, the way they dismissed her legal knowledge, the moment their attitudes shifted when they realized who she was. When the video ended, Danielle glanced at the jury. Some of them looked shocked, others angry. It was clear. The truth was undeniable. The police department's lawyer tried to defend the officers. "This was a misunderstanding," he argued. "The officers were just doing their job." Danielle's lawyer responded firmly. "A misunderstanding does not justify an illegal arrest." He turned to the jury. "And how many other people have faced the same treatment, but didn't have a recording? How many people have been silenced because they didn't have a law degree to protect them?" The jury listened. The judge listened. And Danielle knew this case was already won. After hours of arguments, the judge finally spoke. "The evidence is clear," he said. "This was a wrongful arrest and a violation of constitutional rights. The court rules in favor of Miss Carter." A wave of relief washed over Danielle. The fight had been long, but justice had won. Then the judge continued. "The police department is ordered to pay $1 million in damages to Miss Carter. Additionally, the department must implement mandatory civil rights training for all officers." A murmur spread through the courtroom. This wasn't just a win for Danielle. It was a win for change. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around. Microphones and cameras pointed at her as questions poured in. "How do you feel about the verdict? What's next for you?" Danielle took a deep breath and looked straight at the cameras. "I feel proud," she said. "Proud that justice was served. But this isn't just about me. It's about every person who has ever been mistreated, ignored, or silenced." She paused, letting her words sink in. This lawsuit was never just about money. It was about accountability. It was about making sure this doesn't happen again. The crowd erupted in support. People across the country have followed her story, and now they were inspired. Messages flooded social media.